Welcome back. For those of you new to the channel, I'm a Northern English lad who works and resides in China. I currently live in Shanghai, but I've lived elsewhere across this huge and vast country. Over those 4.5 years that I've lived here, I've come to some understanding about how Chinese society works and the nature of it. I don't like to claim to be any expert. However, with such long-term interactions with the Chinese people and their way of life, I can at least make some delineations from my own experiences and give Westerners, especially those of an Anglo-centric tone like myself, a new view on Chinese society. We all need to come to the understanding that Chinese society is not like our own. Contrary to the millennial liberal narrative that all human beings are exactly the same, Chinese social norms are very different to contemporary Western mindsets. And this Western narrative leaves the West at a fundamental disadvantage when interacting with the Chinese. The Chinese have much higher social cohesion than their Western counterparts. The people here have a much stronger faith in their nation, national culture, and their society. Further developing that, with their past historical experiences with foreigners throughout the 19th and 18th centuries, the government, unlike those previously, are far more resistant to corruption and demoralization. The government here, also unlike those in the West, is taking drastic measures to prevent the diseases contained within globo-hominization. And such measures include countering the feminization of Chinese men and relaxing the national restriction on birth rates like the one-child policy. The propaganda machine here is incentivizing women to choose to sire children rather than go into a career. They're also making more attempts to involve the military in schools and help with more physical activity, to prevent the lowering testosterone rates that are happening, not just here, but all across the world. The Chinese government has made no attempts, nor do I think it ever would, to consider importing populations to prevent a decline. It instead takes more decisions to profit the indigenous population, while continuing to unify the mass of Chinese citizens by eliminating regional differences and homogenizing a national identity with the Chinese Communist Party at its head. Whether this disagrees with your Western sensibilities or any other sensibilities, this doesn't matter. You cannot fault that the Chinese government is taking steps to prevent globo-homo from taking a hold of its people, and it refuses to buckle under the pressure of international finance, Western media propaganda, or continuous threats made by Western major regimes. Even the COVID crisis has been largely overstepped by the Chinese government, and foreign inability to deal with the virus has increased the Chinese popularity in their own government, whilst further entrenching their supposed superiority of governance comparative to Western liberal democracy. One aspect that encapsulates the Chinese method of association and the focus of this video is the sheer multitude of numbers in the Chinese system. There should be no wonder why the Americans are concerned at their hegemony when the Chinese are their main competitors. Purely on the front of population numbers, the Chinese population stands currently at 1.407 billion, which is a lower estimate than probable, purely because the Chinese does not count individuals in its own nation that do not hold an ID card into that statistic. And even if the leeway is 1 or 2%, this remains at several millions, if not hundreds of millions of people being unregistered in the Chinese national population statistic. Comparative to that, the US population stands at around 331 million, almost a quarter of the size of the People's Republic. And even when taking into account the huge mass of unregistered immigration that the US suffers each year, the US can come nowhere close to the Chinese population size. The Chinese also don't just dominate the world in terms of population numbers. Out of the 30th largest cities in the world, 6 of them are in Chinese borders. In terms of global capital, 7 of the 10 largest shipping ports in the world are in the Chinese territory alone. Shanghai is the largest port in main China, but not just in China, the whole world. And at any one point, around 10,000 cargo vessels are going through Shanghai port at any given time. China still remains the largest growing economy in the world, even after the COVID-19 crisis, and it's set to overtake the US in terms of national GDP production levels. Even when taking into account the criticism of these levels and wealth that's reported by the Chinese government, who are known for over-reporting their national statistics, one must realize that the Chinese still have massive room for growth. Over 40% of the Chinese live in a rural lifestyle close to poverty subsistence levels, and there therefore remain serious amounts of wealth expansion available to the Chinese state. One can certainly not say the same for the US, that sees record levels of immigration to offset the burgeoning wealth of a people that demand to be paid $15 an hour for menial wage work. China continually overhires for jobs, and the Chinese have very few social safety nets or welfare benefits, with little or no expectation on the government to bail individuals out for their personally created mistakes. China has no desire to import individuals from outside the sinosphere to continue to prop up its way of life. And to further reinforce the prevention of a collapse, the Chinese have taken plenty of steps to give the people a unifying factor beyond those of economic means. It should be no surprise to anyone, then, that as Pax Americana comes to an end, the nations that were previously part of it will begin to make closer alliances with the Chinese. Obviously, its closest members have other and much deeper rivalries with China, but those like New Zealand have chosen and seen an opportunity for more prosperity outside of the American liberal tyranny that's currently inflicted upon it. This comes about because larger rivals will begin to grow out of the American doctrine, contenders to the liberal democratic capital. And as they begin to grow and thrive, they use the tools of their foes to their own benefit. While the West is crumbling under pressure of its own mistakes that it made nearly 2 decades ago now, China is beginning to forge new relationships across the world, especially with those enemies that America has created as the Great Eagle swept its way through the Middle East and Asia. Whether or not the American empire will fall remains to be seen, but one can surely come to the conclusion that the Americans, with their continuous interference and bullying of smaller nations, deserves to suffer the rise of a new, stronger opponent. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen. Catch you on the next one. 再见.